Tēnā koutou kia ora. Thank you for giving me your time. I wanted to point to three of the placards here in front. I think one says, people before profits, so I want to address that. The other one says TPPA is a crappy deal. And the other one says stop the TPPA. So the speakers before me have been brilliant. They said everything I was going to say. So rather than repeat it over again, I'm going to try to just reinforce it. So I'll begin by saying my interest in the TPPA is because I teach a course on Native peoples at Massey called Endangered Cultures. And if you're interested in the plight of Native peoples, then you have to be interested in the impact of development projects on Native people. And in a nutshell, development projects have been an unmitigated disaster for Native people. They're the poorest, most powerful people on earth, and they sit on resources that multinational corporations want, and governments have facilitated access to those resources by directly overwhelming the rights of Native people. I'll just give you one example. There's many stories that I've followed over the years, but this one was just one little story that was in the Dominion Post. It was titled, 84 Indigenous People Massacred in Peru's Oil War. At least 84 indigenous people have been killed fighting to defend their traditional territories from oil exploration. As part of a free trade agreement with the United States, Peru has altered their constitution and implemented new laws, stripping indigenous tribes of their land rights and opening their lands to oil companies. In response, there has been a massive uprising for the past month, with tribes around the country shutting down major highways, rivers, oil installations, trains, and other critical infrastructure. To put it bluntly, these new laws are a death sentence for the indigenous peoples of the Peruvian Amazon. So what we know is we anthropologists who've studied the impact of free trade agreements on Native people like NAFTA and GATT and the MIA is that they've been an unmitigated disaster for the Native peoples. Money has been made, profit before people. Unfortunately, the money has not trickled down to the Native peoples whose land is being destroyed and their resources stolen. Just the opposite. Some people gather the benefits of a free trade agreement, and a whole bunch of more people pay the costs. And a previous speaker mentioned that when you actually look at the reasonableness of a thing, any scientist will tell you that you have to do a cost-benefit analysis. And the people who are selling us the TPPA are not talking about the costs. And they pretend they don't exist. What they do, as in all propaganda, they stress the putative benefits. And notice I say putative as opposed to real, because putative means claimed or imaginary, because in fact they don't know what the benefits will be. And that's one of the things I've been doing in the last couple of years. I've been trying to look a little bit at what John Keyes says we're going to gain from the TPPA, and he claims we're going to make a lot of money. And he throws out around a lot of figures, and at one point he said it was worth $19 billion. Right? $19 billion gain to New Zealand. Well, I've been looking at it very closely, and there's not a shred of evidence that it will accrue even $1 billion, let alone $19 billion. Because, for example, if one of the things a free trade agreement is supposed to be about is removing tariffs on our products overseas, I've been actually adding up the amount of tariffs that our corporations pay, and they're not very much at all, and they're far less than, in total, all of our corporations overseas apparently pay less than $1 billion a year in tariffs. So for example, the dairy industry makes something like $1.5 billion in foreign trade profits every year, and they pay $19 million in tariffs. Well, $19 million is a lot to me and you, but $19 million out of $1.5 billion, it's a tiny little tax. It's just an operating cost. It's a minimum operating cost. It doesn't have any effect on profits, hardly at all. So purely the removal of tariffs isn't going to reap us billions of dollars of extra profits in our free trade agreements. I want to stress then, because I don't want to repeat too much that other people have said, is the investor-state dispute resolution mechanism. So I've been in a few debates and discussions with the defenders of the TPPA recently. Instead of this wonderful crowd here that's already well clued in and opposed to it, I've actually had to encounter people that want to defend it. And they don't ever mention the dispute resolution mechanism that is so much a problem with the TPPA. And when you ask them about it, they go, boo, 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 and say, oh, it won't do the things you say it will do, even though we say it's already doing it. multinational corporations won't sue us for loss of profits, even if they have the ability to do so, even though we know for a fact that multinational corporations are already involved in what's been described as an orgy of litigation over the things that previous speakers have mentioned, over restrictions on tobacco sales, on nuclear development, on oil prospecting and gold development in the Amazon basin and things like that. So they just go, no, they wouldn't. Even if we gave them this power, they would never use it, and that kind of thing. So right off, it's not really a free trade agreement, or it's minimally a free trade agreement. And again, the defenders of the TPPA insist that no, it really is. That's what it's really all about. And the example I had was in this morning's Dominion Post is a big article. It's got a picture here. It says, "Keep Dancing the TPP Waltz." And it's by Stephen Jacobs, the Executive Director of New Zealand International Business Forum. And he says, the biggest prize from TPP is being part of the framework of the new rules for trade and investment. And then he says in here that it really is, it's all about free trade. And the critics of the TPP said, just don't get it. No, it really is, he reassures us, it's just about free trade. But everyone who's actually studied it said, no, it's not about free trade, and that's the real problem with it. The other thing that the defenders of the TPPA do, other than call us children and call us names and disrespect us, is say that we don't understand that we're opposed to free trade. That's the first thing they say. Well, Jeff Sluka, he just doesn't, he's opposed to free trade. No critic of the TPPA that I have ever heard speak said that they were an opponent of free trade or of trade in general. It isn't trade we're opposed to, it's a crappy trade deal that we're opposed to. Right, and that's the thing here. TPPA is a crappy deal. We're not just in principle opposed to trade or to free trade agreements. We're opposed to bad free trade agreements. And those who've studied what this thing amounts to can prove that it's a bad agreement. So you know the way the investor-state dispute mechanism works, where they have this special court and three lawyers, especially what do you call them, trade lawyers, adjudicate, and there's no right of appeal, and there's no right of representation, et cetera, et cetera. It's a special court outside the system, and its decisions are binding, and the treaty is binding. And again, the defenders of the TPPA frequently say things like, well, they don't undermine our sovereignty because we have our own government, we're our own country, and we can do whatever we want, right? Well, no, that's not true. A treaty is a law. It's a binding law. We can't just decide to arbitrarily, oh yeah, we have a treaty, but we'll just break it. There are consequences to breaking a treaty. There are monetary and international consequences. Your international credit rating will suffer, et cetera, which impacts our ability to negotiate with banks. All kinds of things happen. So it's a serious deal to sign a treaty. It's a binding document. It's not a thing that you can just decide that the government, or say the next government here in Aotearoa, can just ignore. Our governments are not empowered to ignore international agreements and treaties that the previous governments have signed, that kind of thing. So the international dispute resolution mechanism is so bizarre. So again, one of the defenders recently of the TPPA that I was in a debate with said, well, what's wrong with companies being able to sue us for loss of profits? They've invested money, they've tried to develop economic enterprises on the basis of a presumption of profit, and then they didn't get it. And we said, well, first off, this idea of anticipated profits. Well, how do you calculate anticipated profits? You can't. There is no formula for anticipated profits. It's whatever the corporation has said its anticipated profits are. And so it can be any number. It doesn't have to prove that its idea of anticipated profits is realistic. It just needs to claim them. And then some corporate lawyers in the dispute resolution mechanism can decide whether those are reasonable or not. Well, when you think about it, every corporation exaggerates its anticipated profits, don't they? Because hardly ever will a CEO says, no, we actually anticipate that our profits are going to go down. You don't stay in office as a CEO by saying, no, under my leadership, profits are going to go down. They're almost always going to go up. So if you asked Fonterra last year what its anticipated profits for this year are, what do you think? Because what happened, the bottom fell out of the market, and it's gone overnight, huh? And that's the risk that economic enterprises take in the marketplace. And that's why they have to take risks seriously. And one of the risks that they should take seriously is that if you're going to sell cigarettes in New Zealand or develop nuclear power, that those governments, because they're deeply unpopular policies with the people of those countries, that those governments may decide to be democratic and may decide to restrict those in the future, which might bite into your profits. So it's up to corporations to anticipate the risks of new laws and environmental regulations and health regulations and things that might impact their profits. It's not our job then to pay them back when they fail to anticipate those risks. So the whole thing is shabby. And then the defender, the defender who said to us here in the audience, he said, well, you know, corporations already can sue in our courts every day. He says corporations go through our court system if they have been unfairly impacted by illegal or unfair practices. They already in New Zealand go through the courts. Well, that's the point. If a corporation can already sue people through the normal courts within our country for illegal practices and other unfair practices that they think have impacted their profits, then why do they need a special, powerful international court that we don't have any recourse to?
Because they will win in it.
Because they'll win in it. That's exactly right. Because the court is rigged. It's a kangaroo court, is what it is, right? And that was exactly the point. Because what they know is if they fight these things in our courts, then they may lose. In fact, they usually lose, it turns out. But in their own court, they anticipate that they'll win. So then next thing I want to say is, well, you know, I've been studying this for a couple of years, and we're talking to an audience of the convinced already, and again, the speakers before me have already summarized most of my points, so instead of going over those again, I've got the articles here, the information is there, internationally, globally, leading academics, economists, healthcare professionals, all kinds of people have criticized these free trade agreements, and let me just read to you the titles of these articles that I've just read in the last few weeks. Capitalism and the TPP, a kinder, gentler totalitarianism. Trade agreements like TPP will force countries to surrender sovereignty and exacerbate inequality. Free trade or democracy can't have both. Free trade is ravaging national economies. Don't believe the hype about the benefits of free trade. Free trade agreements fail workers at home and workers abroad. UN experts voice concern over adverse impact of TPPA agreement on human rights. Ask Grosser about the impact of the TPPA on human rights. His eyes go square and he goes boo, 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 boo. He hasn't read any of this. He's not interested in the facts. He's not interested in the arguments. He's not interested in reality. He's an ideologue. They believe in free trade. It's like a religious belief. It's not challengeable by reason. The latest hurdle for a rotten trade deal, Malaysia, the TPP, and the slavery provision. So that's why the UN was expressing concerns about it. It turns out there's a law, some countries have laws that they've enacted in the last 10 years that they can't engage in free trade agreements with countries that practice slavery or are involved in human trafficking trade. And Malaysia is one. And so what's happening, like in the United States, is that the supporters of the TPPA are trying to rush through a new law to backtrack on that, to get rid of the law that says that the U.S. can't sign free trade agreements with countries that are involved in the slave trade. TPP, the case for treason. And I was pleased to hear a previous speaker mention that, because I said this a few months ago at a TPPA rally, and I was the only one that said it, and I wondered if I had gone too far. But many academics who study this say that it's essentially tantamount to treason. Julian Assange on the TPP, secretive deal isn't about trade, but corporate control. How trade agreements amount to secret corporate takeover. Trans-Pacific Partnership deal, few benefits, many questions. TPP would deepen income divide. A major AIDS research group says that TPP will make it harder to fight AIDS. So we've seen the previous speaker talk about undermining our effort to reduce smoking, to reduce alcohol consumption, but it affects even AIDS research, that, AIDS, a disease that kills hundreds of thousands of people every year. Trans-Pacific trickle-down economics. We go back to the placard in front of me about people before profits. Ideologues like John Key and the supporters of the TPPA believe in profits. They believe in economic growth, and they believe that it's an unmitigated good. The problem is that profits may be good if everybody gets to share in them, or that if most people get a share of them. And the problem with the profits from the free trade agreements, as demonstrated by the actual consequences of the GATT and the MIA and the previous agreements, is that the profits go in at the top and they stay at the top. So yes, if there are profits, and if our country does benefit, as John Key claims, from the TPPA, whatever benefit comes in is going to be captured at the top of the system, and it's not going to affect you and I. So profits can be good, but not if they don't distribute through society in some reasonable way. If they just come in and enrich the 1% at the expense of everybody else, if wages at the bottom go down while profits go in at the top and are captured up there, then it isn't to the benefit of our country to have that kind of agreement. It does not trickle down. John Key is a bankster. He still believes in the zombie economics of trickle-down economics. The idea that any kind of growth affects economic growth, helps everybody. It does not help everybody. It helps those who can capture it at the top. Do corporations really need more rights? Why fast track the TPPA is a bad idea. As a previous speaker said, do you think that the power of multinational corporations, is there anyone in this room think that we need to give them any more power? They are already the most powerful thing on this planet. They don't have nuclear weapons because they don't need them. They can get what they want without weapons. They are the most powerful thing on this planet. Do you think we should give them some more power?
But they do have nuclear weapons.
And they probably do. Their henchmen, Uncle Sam, as Uncle Sam was mentioning here a moment ago, I think. Their henchmen are in governments who do have nuclear weapons. Trade agreement rigged to protect capital from democracy. Trans-Pacific Partnership and the death of the Republic. The TPP towards absolutist capitalism. TPP agreement poses threat of internet censorship. TPP versus democracy. The Trans-Pacific Partnership will sink the middle class. And then I have a whole list of other ones as well, one of which a previous speaker will enjoy, a Trojan horse for Wall Street deregulation. So that idea that it's a Trojan horse, many academics have said that, made that analogy, that a free trade agreement is a form of Trojan horse. We didn't just make it up. So finally, then again, the problem with this thing is that the defenders of the TPPA, their tactics are to set up straw men. That is to say that the opponents of the TPPA are children, petulant children who should basically shut up and keep their place. That we don't know what we're talking about. That we're anti-free trade when we're not, and then to never mention any of these criticisms of the TPPA. Have you ever heard a defender of the TPPA address any of these specific criticisms? How about in the International Dispute Resolution Mechanism? This article by the bankster doesn't mention it, doesn't even mention it. So again, you see that's a kind of rhetorical and tactic to not mention, because if he mentioned it, he would have to have some argument for why that we shouldn't be concerned about the International Dispute Resolution Mechanism. And he hasn't got one, so he doesn't even mention it. So none of these threats that we're talking about here today is addressed. And again, if the free trade agreement was as good as they say it is, one, they would be able to address these questions, wouldn't they?
Yes. Yep.
Right? If it was so good, they could say, well, yes, but let us show you all the benefits. We can demonstrate the benefits, and they override these. And that's what John Key ultimately says, isn't it? Well, there may be some, it's costs and benefits. There's a few costs to the TPA, but in the weight, the scales of benefit and loss, we have far more to gain than we have to lose. But not then actually tell you how he has calculated that. So I was going to, two things I was going to say there. That was one. Oh, and then the other thing to watch out for then is, as we see now, we're in a terrible moment in our economic history with the dropping out of the bottom of the dairy prices. And they're using that as a way to tell us we need this free trade agreement, huh? They see why we need the free trade agreement? Dairies, the price has fallen out. We need to increase our access to our dairy markets. But the free trade agreement doesn't have anything to do with that. The reason why the bottom is falling out of the dairy prices is because there's a global glut in dairy production. Right? So it is, the idea that opening up markets will allow us to sell more of our dairy products, which we must do since we have these lower prices, doesn't work, because the point is, in a glut market, the prices fall at the bottom. There's so much competition. So watch out for that they're trying to tell us now. And I think that is having an impact on the public perception of the TPPA, that there's this moment, we're in this very moment where people are really concerned about the economy, and they're afraid of, that we're going to need this growth. And in that kind of a political moment, it's easy for them to conclude then that a fair trade agreement, even one with hooks and catches, might be absolutely, necessary for our economy. But that's a misunderstanding of the fundamental way the economy works. And a free trade agreement will not raise dairy prices, and it will not increase our access to dairy markets. And even if it did a little bit increase our access to dairy markets, there's a glut of dairy products, and we need to compete with third world countries now that produce dairy at cheaper prices than we do. And the market is going to buy those dairy products from those producers that have lower prices than us, and that won't be affected by a free trade agreement. So finally, yes, there's something more going on in this free trade agreement than free trade, despite its defenders trying to convince you that it really is a free trade agreement. It is about the growth of corporate power, and the growth of corporate power is done absolutely at the expense of democratic power. Every incremental increase in the power of corporations corresponds with an incremental decrease in the power of our governments to protect our rights and represent our interests, both nationally and internationally. So, and then the final thing I want to say, going back to my interest as an anthropologist in Native peoples, is that the TPPA is totally contrary to the Treaty of Waitangi. If we actually try to respect the treaty and enact its provisions, that means that we can, for example, have to protect Maori resources and Tonga. That includes their environmental resources, and that means that can apply a cost to the anticipated profits of corporations that could make money out of those resources. So just as it undermined the rights of the native peoples of the Amazon Basin, the native peoples of Penang and Sarawak, the native peoples of the Philippines, the native peoples of Malaysia, the native peoples of South Asia, the hill tribesmen of Cambodia and Thailand, free trade agreements have undermined their rights, that undermines Maori rights as well in this country. Thank you very much.